Good evening, everyone. And welcome to this June meeting of a Standards Committee. Let's start with apologies for absence. I know Michael Payne is one of them.
I've also had apologies from Martin Thorpe, the co-opted parish representative.
Martin Thorpe, Okay. Any other apologies?
I'm substituting for Michael Payne.
Yes, I was about to come to that. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Meredith. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, thank you. And very good of you to come and substitute. So the next item is item 2, which is to approve as a correct record the minutes of the last Standards Committee, which was the 10th of March. It will be page 5 to 7 in your packs. Any matters of accuracy, first of all? Can I see a mover for those as a correct record from one of those that were there? Thank you, Councillor Elwood. Thank you, Councillor Bosworth. All those in favour of approving the minutes? Thank you. Those are duly approved. Declarations of interest.
Sorry, just to clarify, is that as a member of Calverton Parish Council? Yeah.
Thank you. That's noted then. Okay. Any other declarations of interest for any item on the agenda? No. Okay. So we are now going to go to the update on recommendations to Committee for Standards in Public Life. That's item 4. We did have circulated a brief update between committees after the last standards meeting. Fran, I don't know if you want to just quickly go through what's in there. From my point of view, there seems to be a sort of a lack of will to actually change anything, and it's pretty much as is, and they're not going to change very much at all. But I don't know if you want to fill us in, Fran.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So, yeah, the government's response to the Cspl report was published just after the last Standards Committee. So I did circulate that response to members, but just thought it might be helpful just to bring a report to the committee just to update you in relation to that response and any sort of actions arising out of it. As you may recall, the Cspl report set out a number of best practice recommendations, as well as some recommendations to government around changes to legislation. In terms of the best practice recommendations, they were all considered by this committee, and an action plan was put in place which has largely been completed to implement those best practice recommendations. In terms of the recommendations that were made to the government to make changes to legislation, the government have now published their response. I've tried to summarise that in the report into sort of sections. So those recommendations in relation to code of conduct, those in relation to independent persons, those in respect of sanctions, and those in relation to disciplining of statutory officers. I think the summary set out in the report and the full response is provided at the appendices. I think generally the response from government is that, certainly in terms of code of conduct, that despite the fact there has been the model code prepared by the LGA, that it is still very much down to local authorities as to what they choose to include outside the statutory requirements, what they choose to include in their code. Similarly, no proposed changes in relation to disclosable pecuniary interests and the criminal sanctions around those. And again, no real strong guidance in terms of any other interests that may be included. In relation to independent persons, there was a proposal that independent persons should be appointed for 2 years only, renewable once, and this should be made a requirement. Again, the government have said that while they recognise the points made around maintaining that independent role over a longer period of time, they also recognise that for local authorities, it's difficult to recruit independent persons. We know ourselves, recently we went out for the reserve IP role and we got no applicants, and we've just gone out again. Unfortunately, we have had applicants on this occasion, but you know, the demand for that role was not particularly high. So the government have recognised that, and again kind of left it to local authorities to determine how they proceed with that. As I say, the full details of the response are appended to the report. What I am going to do is perhaps look at them in more detail, and if I think there's any particular best practice recommendations that we could adopt, that the government is saying we're not going to make legislative changes, but it might be a best practice approach that you want to consider, then I will bring those back to committee and perhaps look at where we can make those changes, either in our arrangements for dealing with complaints or in our code of conduct. But I just wanted to flag that report and response up. I think overall, as the Chair has already alluded to, no real drive from government to make any significant changes around those recommendations at this time.
Thank you, Fran. I mean, you'll find the report there in the appendix and the summary on page 9, 10, 11, and so on your pack. And the ones that, as Fran says, are particularly relevant to us is the term of office for independent people, code of conduct recommendations, and so on. You'll see those on page 10 and 11. So, yeah, any comments from anyone on, first of all? I'll make one, which is that, you know, from my point of view, looking through what Fran has provided, and thank you for doing that, that sort of summarised the position.
I'm having real difficulty hearing in here, and I'm not quite sure why. It was the same yesterday. And I don't know if it's because people are sitting too far away from the mic or people have got particularly soft voices, but it is really a challenge for me. I don't know if anything can be done about it, but I think something has to. I will be contacting the borough anyway, but it's worse now than it was yesterday at the planning meeting. So if you could all speak into your mic, you see, that makes a difference, doesn't it? And I know my voice is quite loud.
It does indeed, yes. I will try and do better. I'm not used to doing that, but I normally expect it to pick it up. But yeah, I will do my best to speak in. So yes, all I was saying that I was waiting for responses to, I think, Fran's excellent summary of where we are, and I was only going to make the position that you know, I don't think there is bandwidth in government to change things very much. We did have a look in detail about the model code and our response to it and how to adopt, and we did make those recommendations and changes last year, and I think we did a good job of work. Is the only comment I was going to make. So if there are any comments that people wish to make, well, let's hear them. Just for the benefit of Rosalie, we're actually on the item dealing with the report on the update to the recommendations from government on the code of conduct and so on. That's where we are. So
thank you very much. Apologies for being late. I couldn't get into the chamber because I don't have a swipe card.
No problem. Councillor Meredith Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to reinforce what you've alluded to. It's good to see that the council itself has taken up best practice, and that also we'll be looking at any other thing we can do, so we can do that job, the government's job, for them without legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? John Bagley.
Can you hear me? Essentially, it's just a question. This recommendation 11, indemnifying the independent persons, I think I've been told a year or two ago that this was in place at Gedling. Can I be assured that I am indemnified against anything that might go spectacularly and hopefully never wrong? This matter was sort of uppermost in my mind after hearing the other side of the river when there was a possibility of subject members concerned perhaps turning towards legal ways of pursuing their complaints and etc.
If I may, I'll check that that indemnity is still valid, and I will confirm to you outside the meeting.
Please don't do anything too rash then, John. Any other comments?
Sorry, mine's not a comment, but just checking, have you discussed recommendations 3 and 4, which were the government's conclusion that councillors should not be always presumed to be acting in official capacity if they're accessing social media, and then recommendation 4, reminding myself what that one says. Similarly that that your any actions are assumed to be in your capacity as a member or representative. Has that been discussed before I arrived? Don't want to repeat.
If I may, Chair, no, we've done a summary of the recommendations as set out in the report. We haven't gone into specific detail on each of them. In relation to acting in capacity, there was some quite a lot of narrative in the LGA guidance that accompanied the model code, some of which was taken into account when we produced the guidance note on our members' code, just sort of providing a little bit more clarity around acting in capacity.
Thank you. The reason I raised it, Chair, is just simply because it's a topic that comes up quite frequently in ours. So whether we agree with the recommendation or the conclusions or not, it settles the question in terms of those times when behaviours, whatever they are, fall outside the remit of the monitoring officer in this standards committee.
As I say, I mean, the government's response is, you know, it's for local authorities to decide what they put in the code and be clear around how they deal with capacity issues when they're providing guidance, and I feel that's what we have done so far. But again, as I did mention perhaps before you came in, what I am going to do is go through those recommendations perhaps with more of a fine-tooth comb, and if there's any best practice that, okay, the government aren't prepared to legislate, but there's any further best practice that we haven't already covered through our code review and through our adoption of the CSPL best practice recommendations, then I will bring those back to committee if there's things that we perhaps want to be more clear on.
Right, thank you, and apologies for making you repeat that again because I was late.
No problem.
Mr. Chair, talking of latecomers, can I just apologise for being late? But I'm here.
You may indeed, Councillor Murray.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. So as we said, we are on those recommendations on the update to the code and so on. Is there anything you, not having seen the discussion or heard the discussion, wish to raise before?
No, nothing. No, thank you very much.
Okay. In which case, what I'm going to do is to ask for a formal proposal to note the report. Thank you, Councillor Towsey-Hinton, seconder for that. Thank you, Councillor Hope. So all those in favour? Thank you. We've noted the report as we said we would, and yeah, if there are any bits that your fine-tooth comb finds, no doubt the September meeting we'll get to know about it. Yeah, thank you. So what we move on to now is a report from a monitoring officer on the recruitment of the independent person and the reserve independent person, which so a panel was held last week, and we have recommended a reserve, and we've recommended a 2-year term for independent person who is actually here tonight. So welcome to him. So the report is set out on pages 25 there. I don't know if you want to introduce what actually happened.
Thank you, Chair. Members will recall at the last committee meeting that we agreed to go out for recruitment to the role of IP and reserve IP for a period of 2 years. That recruitment exercise was undertaken. It was advertised in various locations, and I thank the committee for their suggestions in terms of a wider advertising of that role. As the Chair has mentioned, we interviewed 2 candidates, and recommended in the report, excuse me, is that John Bagley, who is obviously our current independent person, be appointed for a further 2 years, and that Stuart Bembridge be appointed as a reserve independent person under the Localism Act. That's a recommendation to full council, who will agree the final appointment to those roles. As referenced in the report, in terms of the previous CSPL recommendations around maintaining independence of the independent person, I have referenced the response from government in relation to that consultation. We have appointed both applicants that came forward, and I think, as I said earlier, it is recognised by government that whilst that might be a good ideal in terms of practically recruiting to that role every 2 years, it's not always as straightforward as that. So the recommendation is set out on page 25, and that's a recommendation to full council that they agree those appointments.
Thank you, Fran. Just from me, because I was at the panel, and I know there was others there too, that the process was held on Teams because of availability, but both candidates presented extremely well, and we had a good discussion with both of them. Both had the same questions in the same order, and then we came to a decision, and we did that fairly thoroughly. So I'm very pleased with the result, and we were able to appoint and make that recommendation to go forward to council. Anyone else want to ask any questions or make any comments on what you've heard today? In which case, I will ask for a proposer and a seconder for that recommendation. Thank you. But I think Councillor Towsey Hinton beat you to it just by a neck, I think, at Mike Hope. So you'll be seconder on that. So all those in favour? Thank you very much. So that will go forward now to council, full council. Thank you very much. Right, the next on the agenda that I have is a technical thing, which is the approval of delegations because of the update to the Constitution. So again, Fran, I don't know if you want to take us through that.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, members on other committees will be familiar with this report. So following the adoption of the Constitution in March, full council in March, it's just to formalise the delegations, the committee delegations down to officers. Now, there are no significant changes to the delegations from Standards Committee to officers, but there is one additional delegation that's been added in, and that's to conduct the recruitment process for the independent person, reserve independent person and co-opted members to the Standards Committee. So a report will still be brought to the committee to approve recruitment to those roles. It's just the practicalities of carrying out the actual recruitment exercise, advertising and so forth, to enable the monitoring officer to carry out that function following the meetings. Otherwise, there's no significant changes.
Does anyone have any questions or comments? Okay. And I see somebody formally move that recommendation. Thank you. All those in favour?
Do we have a second? Did I miss the second?
Seconder was Councillor Murray, I think. Okay, thank you very much. That's carried. So we move on to a report that comes once a year. And last year we didn't have very much because of, I suspect, because of COVID, and this time probably not so much either. Similarly, report on gifts and hospitality, which is on page, I think it is 35 of your pack.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is a report that's brought annually to the Standards Committee, and it's just an annual update on the Gifts and Hospitality Register for officers and members. Again, it has been a relatively quiet year in terms of gifts and hospitalities. There's been nothing recorded from members. They do get quarterly reminders to make sure that the gifts and hospitality, any reports of gifts and hospitality over £50 are recorded. We've had none forthcoming this year. With officers, again, similar to last year, the numbers were relatively low. 23 offers of gifts were made. There were 3 offers of hospitality this year, which were made during a conference which an officer attended. I suspect as we go into next year and there are more face-to-face events, conferences and things get back to a proper normal, if you like, that there will be an increase in gifts and hospitality. I presented a report to SLT as well, our senior leadership team, about gifts and hospitality for officers. And I said to them, what I'll say here is that over this year, I need to do a review of the code of practice around gifts and hospitality. I'm content that there's been no significant legislative changes, but it's just to make sure that it does remain fit for purpose. And also, I think it's timely with things going back to some sort of normal, that officers are reminded about the importance and significance of recording those gifts in a timely manner. In terms of how the system works, for officers, it's actually an electronic system. So employees put it in the same way they would put in employee claims, and then it comes through to the manager. So every gift that comes through, it does get reviewed by the manager before it's approved or so on. So there is a robust system in place to manage gifts and hospitality for officers. As I say, the code of practice will be reviewed this year. It will have to come back to this committee and ACSC for approval.
Thank you, Fran. I mean, that recommendation on that is on page 37, item 2.1, if people want to see that. Any questions? John.
I think it's interesting that the only one that was declined, the word refused was used, and it was a case of 6 bottles of wine at £30, and I just wondered whether it was sort of refused on the basis that I don't clean my floor with this sort of stuff.
One point of clarification, was that £30 each?
Well, I'm sorry, no, but the word refusal looks pretty drastic to me, rather than it was declined with thanks.
Any other points or questions, including quality of gifts?
Yes, Chair. Following on Mr. Baggerly's remarks, I didn't want to say anything that could be accused of being, what's the word, comical. But it did seem to me that the quality of some of these, I mean, £2 for a latte. Yes, well, I think the officers deserve all they can get, even if some of them are pretty cheap.
I hope you weren't accusing officers of being cheap. That's very nice. We have the recommendation 2.1 on page 37. Again, I'll ask for a mover and seconder, as I must do. Oh, Councillor Towsey-Hinton is there again, and Councillor Hope is there again. So, all those in favour? Thanks very much. carried. So we come now, I think, to the final item, or nearly the final item, Agenda 8, which is the Code of Conduct Complaints update. So as per what we've done in this committee up till now is to have the first part of the discussion as a general one, and then we'll see if we need to move into closed session if there's any specific points about specific items on this report. But in general terms, let's start with that. Fran.
Thank you, Chair. So members will recall at the last Standards Committee there were 3 complaints outstanding. One of those complaints has now concluded, and a decision notice appears in the exempt appendices. The other 2 complaints, which were complaints that had been sent for investigation, are still outstanding. As detailed in the report, I have now had the investigators' conclusions. They were received by me on the 8th of June. In terms of the process for dealing with complaints once they've got to the investigation stage, this is set out in our arrangements for dealing with complaints. The reports come back to the monitoring officer. The monitoring has to consider whether or not she agrees with the findings of the investigators. If it was in a situation where the investigator had recommended there was no breach of the code and the monitoring officer agreed with that, then a decision notice can be issued. If there is a recommendation that there is a breach of the code and the monitoring officer agrees with that, further consultation is undertaken with the independent person to establish whether or not there could be a local resolution or whether a hearing panel needs to be called in relation to that investigation. Given the timing of the reports arriving, we're not in a position to advance that at today's committee, but there will be an update in due course depending on the outcomes of those discussions and consultations. In relation to new complaints, so since the committee meeting in March, I have had 3 new Code of Conduct complaints. 2 of those have concluded, and again, the decision reports in relation to those appear at the exempt appendix. One of those is still outstanding as being considered for an initial decision.
Thank you, Fran. Any general points, first of all?
I just wondered whether Calverton Parish Council have had any training on this, which members of the public in Calverton could be aware because of the extent of the complaints that seem to come from them. I have to say that in all my 33 years on Colic Parish Council, I think we only ever had 1 complaint, but this seems quite excessive for the short time.
Thank you. I don't know, Fran, if you want to have a general response on that.
It has been raised. It's on the action log. There are a number of complaints coming out of Calverton Parish Council as to any sanctions or remedies in relation to those complaints. They're set out in the exempt appendices when they apply. You've asked a specific question about training. It's a valid question, and I do need to speak to Calverton Parish Council around training needs at the authority.
Councillor Bosworth.
I'd just like to say something as a parish councillor from Calverton. 5 councillors have resigned during this 3-year period we've just done. So, we've been getting new councillors all the time. There's 1 or 2 people who've been on before and have done the councillor training, but the new ones we've got now haven't done any councillor training. Also, the chair has had no training in being a chair as far as I know. So, it's been difficult all round. I don't know whether you want to say anything, Mike.
No.
Thank you for those comments. Is there any, John, you've got your indication.
At the interview process for the position of independent person, one of the questions you asked me was whether I could think of any cases that raised ethical issues. Having dealt with, between Gedling and Rushcliffe, somewhere about 200 cases, I had difficulty in thinking on my feet, as it were. And I think in nearly all cases where it involves bullying and of clerks, in particular at the parish council level, that's always, to me, a serious issue and raises all sorts of problems. And it is a pity, frankly, out of those 200 complaints, that the vast majority are sort of shallow, vindictive, vexatious, and totally inappropriate. And you can see from the figures that nearly all of them get pushed back. It doesn't necessarily mean that we find that the councillors involved, the subject members involved, are perfectly behaved councillors. The case, often the reason they're pushed back is because of loopholes, of misunderstandings, and that sort of thing. But to be honest, I think that both here and at Rushcliffe across the river, that an awful lot of monitoring officers' time is wasted in pursuing quite trivial offences or claims of breaches of the code, where none frankly exist, or if they were approached with common sense, none would exist. I think here of one particular parish in Gedling, where some real issues of substance, mainly regarding environment and planning, were raised, one of which I believe ended up with judicial review. And yet those were all settled on just one, each one on a single set of, not a full investigation, but just sort of question and answer. And I think in 2 or 3 of them, I was approached by the subject member, as they are permitted to do, and it was a question of sorting the thing out rationally and calmly. And these were issues of real local concern with pros and cons, and they were always sorted out reasonably satisfactorily, although there was obviously there may have been, if planning things were turned down or approved, there would be disappointed people, but there was always, and there was no backbiting or particular problems that followed up from that. So you can have serious cases that are dealt with firmly and equitably, I think.
Thank you. If I could just sort of add a little bit to the discussion. I don't want to get into specifics, it's not my role to do so, but I think that I have a certain level of frustration, let's put it like that, in that there are a number of these things coming out of one place, and it is expensive for Gedling to deal with. It's also time-consuming for Gedling to deal with. And if we can find, either through training, as Councillor Lawrence has indicated, might be an issue, or by sort of trying to see whether there's some resolution in terms of personalities, I don't know. But somehow or another, the number of complaints that's coming out of one place is disproportionate to the position overall, and is taking far too much of the monitoring officers and other people's time. And really, I think it needs to improve in some way.
If I could just add a comment, there was a query last time from Councillor Murray about the length of time the full investigation cases were taking. And I think I explained at the time how these things can get dragged out, having been involved particularly recently, last year, in a particularly difficult one at Bingham. And I've just been told tonight that if you Google Newark Advertiser and Bingham Town Council, it will tell you the full story. So you can see how things get spun out, involving vast amounts of time for the poor monitoring officer, and also in order to set up full hearings with videoing and all the rest of it, it can be very, very time consuming for more officers of the council as well.
Thank you. Are there any other comments of a general nature? Councillor Murray.
Sorry, I'm not sure whether it's entirely of a general nature. It relates to the complaint we have at page 57 of our papers, STD 002993. I wanted just to raise an issue about emails I think all councillors received from this complainant.
We're going to have to go, I think, into closed session.
Yes, I thought that might be right.
Yes. Are there any other